Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm glad I was able to catch your eye and participate in the debate today and follow my good friend, the member for Foothills. There's a disconnection between everything that this government has said about fiscal restraint and the numbers contained in the budget that this bill promises to implement. Some might call it the pants on fire budget. This budget puts the lie to everything the Liberals have said from the 2015 election to last year's budget. Just last year, the minister said, quote, "We are absolutely determined that our debt to GDP ratio must continue to decline. This is our fiscal anchor, a line that we shall not cross, and that will ensure that our finances remain sustainable for as long as it remains unbreached." Well, they didn't waste any time in breaching that line. This bill implements a budget with an increased debt to GDP ratio. They blew through that sacred line that quickly. This budget is the culmination of what is now approaching a decade of lies contained in 3 election campaigns, numerous past budgets, past fiscal updates, and in countless statements in this House and in communities across Canada. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I give you the solemn commitment that the Liberals made during the 2015 election. Quote, "We will run modest short-term deficits of less than $10 billion in each of the next 2 fiscal years to fund historic investments in infrastructure and our middle class. After the next 2 fiscal years, the deficit will decline and our investment plan will return Canada to a balanced budget in 2019, unquote. Madam Speaker, that wasn't a casual throwaway line. That was a critical point that they made carefully to differentiate themselves from both the Conservatives and the NDP. They were going to be the only party, or they were the only party promising deficit spending, but they knew, Madam Speaker, that there was political consensus at that time that budgets ultimately had to be balanced. They knew that Canadian voters wouldn't vote for unrestrained, reckless, and out-of-control spending without a clear, credible plan for a balanced budget within the mandate that they're seeking. So they made that pitch to Canadians. Even the NDP then knew that there was cross-political, cross-partisan support, consensus even, that budgets had to balance. And that's why the Liberals did it. They had this solemn promise to run modest deficits for a very short period of time in order to fund unprecedented infrastructure construction that would lead to economic growth that would allow the budget to balance itself. Well, Madam Speaker, every part of that election promise, that critical election-winning promise, turned out to be untrue. They did not run modest $10 billion deficit. They did not build unprecedented new infrastructure. The budget did not balance itself. Every single word in that promise was untrue, Madam Speaker. Since winning the election in 2015, not one member of this government or its party's caucus has ever acknowledged even having made that promise. This was a promise that they made to differentiate themselves, and they broke it. And this government treats its own election promises like things that can be just tossed into an Orwellian memory hole to be forgotten forever as if they were never spoken or never said. I was present, Madam Speaker. The leader of the opposition repeatedly asked Bill Morneau, what year is the budget going to be balanced? And he just acted like they never made the promise, that it was all just something that could be ignored. It was the promise they made to win the election, Madam Speaker. Now this became the thing they would do. They would talk about the ever-declining debt to GDP ratios. In the fall 2017 economic statement, they said, quote, "The government will maintain this downward deficit and debt ratio track, preserving Canada's low debt advantage for current and future generations." So nothing about balanced budgets, no apology for the fraudulent way they campaigned in 2015. 2018, quote, "Anchored by a low and consistently declining debt to GDP." From the fall 18 economic statement, quote, "The government continues to deliver on its commitment to strengthen and grow the middle class while at the same time carefully managing deficits." Well, what nonsense, Madam Speaker. Careful management of the deficit would be to not run one during a time of relatively stable and strong international economic expansion. They might have also thought about better managing Canada's debt and not being addicted to issuing short-term debt, which would protect Canadians from higher interest rates that are now upon us. 2019, quote, continuing to reduce the federal debt relative to the size of our economy. So early 2020, Madam Speaker, I'm talking pre-COVID. I'm talking about February 2020. Weeks before any world jurisdiction had taken economy slowing COVID measures. Canada was on the brink of recession. Private sector economists had forecast Canada's debt to GDP ratio was going to rise for the first time since the 08-09 banking crisis. This was before COVID. So they ditched their lines about declining debt to GDP for a while. The opposition warned them, though, Madam Speaker. We warned this government that during a time of relative global prosperity and growth, it was reckless to run uncontrolled structural deficits, resulting from undisciplined spending growth and lowering growth through job-killing tax increases and terrible regulations like C-69. We told them that they were spending the cupboards bare and that they would leave Canada less capable of coping with a global catastrophe, like, say, a pandemic or a war in Europe. Of course, the opposition didn't predict these things. Nobody could. But the point is that unforeseeable events like pandemics, like natural disasters, like war, like financial crises, like global political crises, they always happen. There's never been a multi-decade period in human history where these events haven't happened, yet the Liberals spent their entire pre-COVID tenure pretending that times would always be good, and the entire post-COVID period assuming that things will just simply always naturally get better. Well, look where we are today. They've blown through their sacred promise of continual decline in our debt to GDP ratio. The government has presided over a 53% bloat in the cost of the federal public service and record spending on outside private contractors at a time when service delivery has never been worse and the state of labor relations between workers and management, this means the Liberal cabinet, have never been worse. We're in the midst, still not finished, with the worst public sector strike in Canadian history. So, how do you do that, Madam Speaker? How do you spend more than any government in history and have the worst record on service delivery and the worst strike? It's astonishing, Madam Speaker. And I wonder how much time I might have left. If you could give me the signal, thank you. Just a couple of minutes, and there's a number of things that I'd want to go. It's tough to do in 10 minutes, but they are now asking us to approve a bill with $70 billion in new spending, an increase of the deficit of $40.1 billion, an increase to $40.1 billion. Debt service charges now at $44 billion, shortly going to $50 billion a year, with an increasing debt to GDP ratio, something they said could never happen. With billions in losses projected at the Bank of Canada, the possibility of which they also dismissed out of hand when the opposition leader and I both raised it at the Finance Committee in 2020. This bill has a host of tax increases on everything from air travelers to beer, wine, and spirits, and of course the carbon tax, which is a tax on everything, and something they also promised would never exceed $50 a megaton, and it's going to triple that amount. So they've done all of this with absolutely no tangible path to fiscal reckoning other than just hoping for the best, having blown through their last promise in a long litany of broken promises going back to 2015. So I'm not buying it, Madam Speaker. I oppose this bill as I've opposed this government since I was elected. I'll vote against the implementing this budget, and I urge my NDP and Bloc colleagues to join me. They ran in opposition to this government. They were elected in opposition to this government, and if they agree with me that this government is deceitful, arrogant, untrustworthy, and incompetent, then I beg them, in fact, I double dog dare them to vote down this Budget Implementation Act, bring down this government, and let Canadians decide who will support this.
And I have a point of order for the honourable member from the honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
I want to know, Madam Speaker, if you can ask the clerk whether a double dog dare represents an attempted intimidation of the opposition.
I would say, the honourable member, it's
I want
a point of discussion and not a point of order. The questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable